Antony Armstrong-Jones cheated on Princess Margaret many times, but it took until 2004 for a DNA test to prove the depth of his depravities. Not only did he have an illegitimate daughter who'd been born during his honeymoon, but her mother's identity was the biggest shock of all. He may not have been born into the nobility, but no one could say that Antony Armstrong-Jones's family was anything less than upper class. While his father's career as a barrister was prestigious, his mother's second marriage took them up to the next level. Her new husband was Lawrence Parsons, aka the 6th Earl of Ross. Antony was now part of a noble family, and that meant a lot in 1930s England. He was shipped off to a series of boarding schools, including Eton, where he took up photography, boxing, and rowing, though he still had to contend with a limp from an earlier battle with polio. He next made his way to Cambridge University to study architecture. For a while it seemed like he'd found his niche, until he failed his second-year exams. It seemed like a simple bump in the road, but it actually wound up changing the entire course of his life. Though other members of his family encouraged him, his normally cold parents grew even more disapproving when he suggested that he become a career photographer. Thanks to his upbringing, his noble stepfamily, and his years at England's most prestigious schools, Antony had friends in high places. Throughout the 50s, he made his name taking fashion photos and portraits of stage stars, and he also started to live it up. It was no secret that after taking photos of gorgeous young women in his studio on Pimlico Road, he'd invite them to stay for the raucous parties he held there, but even more scandalous rumours soon began to spread about him. He had plenty of gay friends, and stories about his male affairs followed him for years afterward. After conquering the worlds of fashion, theatre, and studio photography, Antony came up with his next move. He wanted to take royal portraits. He was in the right place at the right time, and Queen Elizabeth II tapped him to take a number of photos of her family. Though his relaxed style was controversial, the Queen was thrilled with his work. At that moment, the rakish and handsome young photographer seemed like a welcome addition to their circle. As his success and proximity to the royal family intensified, Antony learned to keep his private life private. He was polite and charming, but tight-lipped about his romantic pursuits. The only relationship that he allowed the gossip writers to speculate on was his long on-and-off situation with showgirl Jacqueline Chan. But by the late 50s, he was simply using her to cover up a much more scandalous romance. What had begun as a friendship with Princess Margaret, the Queen's sister, was blossoming into something more. While they'd appear together in groups in public, the princess took great delight in disguising herself and sneaking away to see Antony, who'd ask her opinions on his ongoing work. Though the royal family was determined to navigate this relationship differently than Princess Margaret's previous one to Peter Townsend, which ended under intense media scrutiny, they still needed a major sacrifice from Antony. He'd need to give up his career if he was going to marry Margaret. He was on board, and long before the press even knew there was a romance, he began to quietly extricate himself from his professional commitments. In 1960, a press release announced the engagement of Princess Margaret and Antony Armstrong-Jones. Everyone involved was thrilled, with one glaring exception. Antony's father reacted in a typically cold fashion, expressing his doubts that his son was cut out for the job, and comparing his temporary home in Buckingham Palace to being confined to barracks. The couple married on May 6, 1960 in a lavish ceremony. It was a historic first. No royal wedding had ever appeared on TV before, and 20 million people tuned in. For their honeymoon, Antony and Margaret embarked on a 6-week trip to the Caribbean. They missed a number of events, including the birth of Antony's friend Jeremy Fry's child, an event that would later come back to haunt Antony. But for the moment, it looked like they were finally getting their happy ending. More traditional segments of the British press did not approve of the union between the princess and a commoner like Antony. He dealt with snobbery from all angles, even at home, where some servants would treat him rudely since he wasn't equal to the other royals. Unfortunately for Antony, there were also a number of minor clashes with the royal family. Prince Philip had always been cold to him, but after the marriage, this became a pronounced distaste. Whereas Antony was artistic and sensitive, Philip was a rugged outdoorsman. Between that, press scrutiny, and the fact that he'd given up his career, there was a lot of pressure on Antony. It would only be a matter of time before the cracks began to show. Princess Margaret gave birth to a son in November of 1961, and Antony accepted the royal title of Earl of Snowdon. Princess Margaret may not have shared many of the same interests as Antony, but they did have one thing in common. Both were in the middle of swinging London in the early 60s, and they took advantage of it. While Antony found his way into a circle that included many bigwigs at Vogue, Margaret made friends with celebrities like the Beatles and Peter Sellers. In 1964, Princess Margaret gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Sarah. They were just 4 years into their marriage, and on the surface they looked like the perfect family. But by 1965, the distance and the pressure of life as a royal had finally gotten to Antony. He needed time away, so he planned a trip with a friend from the publishing world. But something was amiss. The palace claimed that Margaret couldn't go on the trip because she needed to be at home in the Queen's absence. In reality, Antony had begun to spend a significant chunk of his time with married Vogue editor Pamela Collin. Instead of slipping further into a depression, Princess Margaret decided two could play at her husband's game. First, she had a fling with her daughter's godfather, a man named Anthony Barton. She also began to spend more and more time with the actor Peter Sellers. There were rumours about dalliances with famous figures like Mick Jagger, Warren Beatty and Leslie Hutchison. Then there was the affair with Robin Douglas Home, nephew of the former Prime Minister. The affair may have been brief, but it had disturbing repercussions. 18 months after it ended, Douglas Home took his own life at just 36 years old. This was just the beginning of many years of back and forth cheating between the royal couple. They made everyone around them uncomfortable, and while Antony seemed otherwise unbothered, Margaret was miserable. The rest of the royal family was acutely aware of the problems between Margaret and Antony, but hoped that the two could just lead separate lives quietly enough and spare them the embarrassment and scandal of a divorce. The couple went along with it, but it weighed much heavier on Margaret than it did her husband. She acted out by drinking and acting rudely in public. As a result, anti-monarchists began to criticise her and the costs of her upkeep. But it would take a few more years of drama before the consequences finally caught up with her. As the swinging 60s came to a close, the constant cheating lost its lustre and became just another drudge in the lives of Antony Armstrong-Jones and Princess Margaret. On their honeymoon, a friend had gifted Antony and Margaret a 6-acre plot of land on the small island of Mystique in the Caribbean. While Antony had never gone back, Margaret had used it as a refuge during the rockiest parts of their marriage. And it was there that she took Roddy Llewellyn, the slacker son of a famous British equestrian. They were friends for a couple of years and met when he was 25 to her 43. It seemed like just another affair in a long string of indiscretions, but this would be the one that blew everything up. Notorious press magnate Rupert Murdoch had sent a New Zealand journalist to Mystique who pretended to vacation with his wife. While there, the writer caught a photo of Margaret and Roddy together. The publication of those photos was the final nail in the coffin for not only Antony and Margaret, but also for the royal family's view of their cold, distant marriage. They knew that they finally had to admit that things weren't right, but Antony was tired of waiting. For his part, he was spending more and more time as a documentarian and working closely with a production assistant named Lucy Lindsay Hogg. He'd made inroads to get a legal separation, only for the royal family to procrastinate moving on the subject, but Antony had a trick up his sleeve. He announced the separation himself, without the consent or knowledge of Margaret or the royal family. The couple divorced in 1978, and Antony wasted no time moving on. His relationship with Lucy Lindsay Hogg had crossed over from professional to romantic long before this, but it still came as a surprise to Margaret when Antony announced that he'd be marrying Lucy just 5 months after their divorce. They tied the knot in December of 1978, but it wasn't exactly happily ever after. Though Antony had lost the bitterness that had characterised the last 10 years of his marriage to Princess Margaret, he hadn't kicked all of his old bad habits. Somewhere between his separation and divorce, he'd begun an affair with married journalist Anne Hills. She was shocked when she read that he'd tied the knot with Lucy, but not quite willing to give him up over it. Because his marriage was ostensibly going well, he kept his affair with Anne Hills a secret instead of using it to hurt his wife the way he had with Margaret. The affair went on for a whopping 20 years. Anne had always wanted more from Antony, but with each passing year it became clear that she would never get it. She saw other people and even had live-in boyfriends, but she still longed for Antony. After writing a column for The Guardian for many years, she was let go in late 1996. Another boyfriend had just left her and she'd spent yet another Christmas without Antony. Deeply depressed, Anne Hills took her own life. She left a note telling Antony that she'd always loved him and asking for a family heirloom he'd given her to be returned to him. When the authorities investigated, they collected her diaries, containing all the details of her 2 decades with Antony. Before long, newspapers splashed the contents of those diaries across their pages, and that was how Antony's wife Lucy learned that he'd been cheating on her for the entire duration of their marriage. 2 years after the press had blown up Antony's long-term affair with Anne Hills, Lucy uncovered another bombshell. He'd fathered a child with a magazine editor named Melanie Cable Alexander, who was nearly 30 years younger than him. Ultimately, he parted ways with Melanie, and Lucy filed for divorce. Once again, Antony's libido drove him to move on quickly, and plentifully. Remarkably, Antony and Lucy remained friends after their divorce, and she took care of him in his final years. And it was actually in those final years that many of his most scandalous secrets finally came out. Tony's indiscretions were not limited to women. People speculated that he was gay, and according to one biographer, he later admitted to being bi. Some men have claimed that they had romances with him, but this remains unproven. The public watched Antony Armstrong-Jones's marriage to Princess Margaret fall apart in front of their eyes, but it actually started much earlier than anyone realised. While both Antony and his wife hit each other below the belt, he clearly instigated the whole thing. In 2004, DNA testing proved that he had an illegitimate daughter who was born just weeks into his marriage with Margaret. It was revealed that a British woman named Polly Higson was Antony's daughter and that she was born during his honeymoon with Margaret. Polly, whose mother was Camilla Fry, grew up thinking her father was Jeremy Fry, a member of the family behind Fry's Chocolate. Jeremy had been best friends with Antony and had nearly been the best man at his wedding to Princess Margaret, meaning that not only had Antony cheated, he'd done it with his best friend's wife. Though both Jeremy Fry and Antony initially denied the story, Antony later admitted it was true after Fry's death. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.